All right, YouTube. This is a reaction video for the Linux Gaming Challenge Part 2 that LTT is doing. I find this series to be like really entertaining and I've enjoyed it. I've been an LTT fan now for about 10 years, and I can say that early on, like they kind of planted these like first little seeds in me to like start really getting interested in like understanding certain like technical concepts, and that interest has sort of like played into a career path that has been really rewarding for me. I remember when Linus was like the only one on camera. He had one test bench that was like red and blue looking and like kind of plasticky. So we've both come a long way. Yeah, I'm happy to have the opportunity to sort of share my experience. I'm a relatively green junior developer. I've got about 2 years on the job practical coding experience. I've got about 7 years on the job experience as a PC repair technician, working on laptops and other small consumer devices, desktops included. I've also got a few years of doing just like basic IT, operations jobs, like laying down, cat cable in walls and climbing up on ceiling tiles and putting in access points and, like remoting into managed clients' computers and like just helping them install Office or something like that. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride. I've got about 5 years experience daily driving Linux. I'm by no means a Linux expert, but I'm comfortable in the environment, and generally I am sort of aware of like what's happening in the Linux world. So yeah, that's my perspective. Let's just jump into it. I'll chime up when I feel like I need to. For the most part, I think that their observations are pretty much on point. There's some things I disagree with. There's some things that I think could need a bit more clarification. So yeah, we'll just cross those bridges when we get to it and try to have some fun here.
And no points will be awarded for having an ugly or bad sounding stream. It's got to look every bit as legit from a viewer perspective as it did on Windows.
Immediately, I started overthinking.
So this sounds like a fun challenge. I like Luke. He's so fun. All right, let's get back to it. Sorry about that.
Things. Sometimes that's the problem with knowing just enough to be dangerous.
Sometimes.
I tried to
Yes.
apt-get OBS, the industry standard for desktop capture and streaming, in the terminal, only to discover that Manjaro, the Linux distribution that I'm using, doesn't come with apt because apt is for managing packages on Debian
Yes,
and related
on
OSs.
Debian. Ooh, okay.
Oops. Making life more.
So like, let's not laugh at Linus here. Like this is a fairly common like new user mistake, right? Like as you're kind of hopping, you're like distro hopping, you're trying to find the flavor of the week that like you feel comfortable in, right? And in the Linux world, like luckily, like despite the amount of distributions that are out there, at least the ones that are popular today, like the locations of certain like system specific files and the syntax of commands, like they're going to be mostly the same sort of across the board. There are some pretty important distinctions to be made across the distributions where those things are different, and you're going to run into that. But by and large, for the most part, what you're going to notice day to day is those differences are actually going to be mostly relevant when you're interacting with your package manager. So yeah, that confusion is fairly typical there.
Difficult. The message that comes up when you try to execute the command doesn't say, hey, you should probably be using Pacman, you dunce.
So that's funny, and he sort of has a point there. Like I can understand that like messages returned back through the CLI aren't always super transparent. That being said, Bash is quite a bit better than most CLIs out there. Like, for example, if you're trying to like run a package that you like don't have installed, it's gonna say, hey man, I don't know what this word is that you're telling me to understand. You're telling me to do something, and I don't really know what you mean, but I have a means of like looking and trying to figure out what you need to get you on the right track. So sometimes like if you're entering, commands that are related to packages that you don't have, it'll say, hey, maybe you should try installing apt. I'll get into that in just a second about why you probably shouldn't do that. All right, so in my experience, And there are some Linux wizards out there that that might disagree with me. There's people out there that have built their own environment from the ground up, like running the kernel and then adding a Windows manager, a package manager, an audio stack, a network stack, like on and on and on, right? Like this is a thing that people do. My school of thought, by and large, is that like you really shouldn't try to use a package manager that ships outside of the distribution that you're using. There may be some people that disagree with me on that. I think by and large, like what I've heard from the community and like what I've experienced personally is that this tends to cause problems. If you're a developer, like you're going to use other package managers like npm or Yarn or a bundler or a Linux brew, whatever. But for system specific stuff, if you're a novice user and maybe just in general, I would just recommend sticking to the package manager that ships on your distro. I really can't think of a practical reason of why you would want to do this.
It tries to install some kind of dependency for apt,
Yes.
then just quietly fails and prompts you to do the same thing again when you try to use it. Infinite loop, baby.
So that's a little weird. Let me touch back onto his point about the CLI not like returning an error message that was useful to him at that point in time. So there's a fairly good technical reason for this, and it's not so much a limitation or like a shortcoming of how Manjaro or how Bash works. This is actually just sort of a reality of like how CLIs work in general, right? I believe this is the case for CMD, for PowerShell, for terminal on Mac OS, right? Like when you run a command that is associated with a package that you have installed, like essentially what's happening there is Bash, and I'm going to try not to trip up my words here. Bash is taking your input and it's passing it in Linux to something called the shell. And the shell sort of exists, there's user space up here, the shell sits in the middle, and then there's kernel space. There's like the meat and potatoes of like where things happen in the operating system, right? So Bash sends that input to shell, and shell looks at what you've written in, and it looks at it and tries to decipher it. Now, shell has in it like a lot of like environmental, what are called environmental variables. And for this instance specifically, there's one that's relevant, and that environmental variable is called path. And path informs the shell of where all these little dependencies, these little like binaries for the command that you're running exist. And in fact, like all commands, pretty much all commands that you're running from the command line, they're like these little tiny programs that exist in like specific system files. And path sort of informs shell of where those things are. So you type in a command, that goes to the shell. The shell then says, okay, I think I understand like what you're asking of me, and it then pokes the kernel and says, hey kernel, the user has requested that we do this. You need to figure out what you need to do, schedule some CPU time, allocate some resources, like let's get this thing popping off because the user expects something to happen now. So in the case where you are trying to reference a package in a command that when you don't have that package installed, like what essentially is sort of happening is that Linus is sort of like spitting a word out like at Linux that Linux has absolutely no context for. It's never heard this word before. And Linux is not returning him the message he's looking for because like it's not correcting him, right? It's not saying, hey, like you should pronounce this a little bit differently. You didn't say this quite right. And the reason why it's not doing this is because Linus is essentially speaking French. And yeah, the shell doesn't understand that. So that's why you didn't see the error message you were expecting. That's kind of a weird, almost explanation of it, but I think it's fairly non-technical and hopefully it's relatable. I don't know if I bungled that up, but let's keep moving.
Speaking of which, I had a panic moment when I checked OBS compatibility and found out that it is actually unsupported
Okay,
in
hold
Arch,
on.
by the way, and its derivatives.
This is not true, my dude. I've seen that document that you're reading. I'm familiar with some of the terms in that document and what they mean. Take a look at this again and scroll up to the header of the document and read over it, and that should make it a bit more clear about what those terms mean. OBS is definitely supported. It's very good support across pretty much any distribution that's relevant today. Take another look at that.
But the good news is that upon launch, I was immediately relieved to find that it works exactly as expected.
It's pretty sweet.
With some exceptions. For example, the NVENC new encoder doesn't show up as an option, which...
Yikes, why? I'm not sure if there's a new NVENC encoder, but I know NVENC encoding has been a thing on OBS and for Linux now for quite a while. There could be a lot of reasons why that's not showing up in your preferences menu. Take a look at that same document that you were just looking at. There is a guide for different distributions. If that is not specific enough and doesn't give you the results that you're looking for, look for a recent, relevant Manjaro specific guide, and that should clear it up. I don't know if this is the case in every distribution. I know on my last install of Fedora, when I installed the Nvidia proprietary driver, I also got the NVENC stuff in the CUDA libraries. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's the case on every distribution, but it's definitely supported. At least some version of it in OBS is. So take a look at that.
appears to be down to Nvidia's poop-tastic drivers on Linux. Side note here, I always kind of assumed that the Linux community was grousing about Nvidia primarily for their locked-down proprietary approach to things, and that it had less to do with the actual quality of the product. Now, I properly understand that it is definitely both.
Yeah, it's honestly a little bit of both. See, what kills me about Nvidia on Linux is that the products and the driver to a certain degree actually performs fairly well. You get pretty good FPS with Nvidia cards on Linux. There are some issues though. A big issue is when you're running games in Proton, and I think this is true in other other runtime environments as well. Shader compilation time on Nvidia hardware, or at least the series of card that I have, is generally pretty bad. This sort of manifests itself in when you're playing a game on Proton. If there's a lot of animation or shadows happening on the screen, you'll get this kind of weird strobe thing where the animation just kind of goes for a second. On some titles this isn't that bad, and on other titles it's noticeable. AMD apparently has a faster compiler that remedies a lot of this problem. If you're running an Nvidia card and you're not getting a good performance, what I would suggest that you do, if you haven't already, there is a enable shader pre-caching option available in the Steam preferences that it'll do two things. I think when you're playing the game and after you close the game, it will compile the shaders that were already processed. And I actually think sometimes it'll actually pull down shaders from the cloud that will be sort of bundled in when you run the game. This can significantly reduce that issue, although it's still problematic. The second part of the issue with Nvidia products on Linux is that the user experience for the control panel is terrible, and he's about to get into that. So yeah, let's take a look at that.
As mentioned, core product functionality from a couple of years ago is missing.
Yes.
The control panel looks like it's from 10 years ago.
Yes.
And the interface is kind of confusing.
So I get you, Nvidia. I hear you. There's not many of us Linux gamers out there, I guess, from a pure numbers perspective, but you are a big company that makes quality products. And this is unacceptable, my dudes. I know it's effort, but at the very minimum, maybe you don't have to change all the wheels and cogs behind this thing, but at least make it look nice. There are a lot of people that are gaming on Linux that aren't that technically proficient, that don't want to dive into configuration files and manually change things. and this UI is frankly a little confusing. Not only that, it's kind of actually essential that some boxes be checked in here in order to ensure that you're getting the best performance out of your NVIDIA card. And for NVIDIA, that should be a priority. It makes no sense to me. I'm sorry.
Thankfully, I was able to enable G-Sync on my display, but for whatever reason, you allow it in order to
Confusing.
actually turn it on, which you then verify in a completely different tab.
Yep.
And this kind of confusion is not a deal breaker. It's just obvious that the Linux software has never gotten the kind of TLC from the UX team that the Windows software does.
For me, acquiring OBS was no problem. I just got it from the package manager and it was all okay. Once installed though, we noticed something. Window capture on Linux can be a little
Sweet, you just got it.
We couldn't seem to get it working at all at the start. I
Yeah,
had an
it's
option
weird
for
sometimes.
it, but it didn't work, and Linus didn't even have that. But
I've been lucky. I haven't had this issue with OBS yet.
a few days later, I tried it again for a different project, and it worked just fine. I checked in with Linus, and his did too.
The Linux gremlins, man. Linux magic, Linux gremlins. Sometimes things stop working and sometimes things work. There could be reasons other than that, other than just like bugs getting fixed, but like it's a thing. It happens. This happens in Windows sometimes. Like your application takes a crap and you need to reinstall it. It's an unfortunate reality.
Neither of us know what might have fixed it, but that's cool, I guess.
The bigger issue for me ended up being the software that just doesn't exist. There are third-party tools, for example, that allow key remapping. Keyboarding Master is evidently a popular one.
Okay.
But if your peripherals have a manufacturer-provided tool
You are SOL sometimes on that, kind of.
that is
Kind
used
of.
to reconfigure RGB lighting or
We don't talk about RGB. It's shameful.
the lift-off distance of your mouse or the sensitivity steps of your DPI button, then get ready to install Windows in a virtual machine, pass those devices through, configure them, and then hand them back over to Linux.
Ouch. I'm sorry that you have to do this. This is one way, I guess, of remedying that problem if you're not getting the experience you need. But yeah, that sounds like a pain. Ouch.
It's extremely tedious and doesn't even remotely restore full functionality. For example, don't expect to get a low battery warning for your G Pro wireless mouse. And it's even worse for my audio interface. The Go XLR has a handful of unique features, including decent preamps, reprogrammable screen labels, a built-in soundboard function, and the infamous beep button that I am so fond of using during my live streams.
I like the beat button too.
About the kind of bullshit that Nvidia puts them through, I'll have it in the affiliate link down below, by the way. The bad news about it is that, as far as I can tell, TC Helicon has given exactly zero thought to Linux whatsoever.
Yeah, and that sucks because they make a lot of really good, like high quality audio equipment. I will say this. I have been extremely lucky when it comes to my peripherals. I have a room full of peripherals behind me, and by and large, like all of them have just sort of worked without much of a fuss. I understand that that's not the experience that everyone has. What I can offer you is this. If you are serious about, making Linux your daily driver, this is the only operating system you're going to run. Before you plunk down that serious cash, do some reading, get on Reddit, see what other people's experiences are. This is still a relevant issue, although I genuinely do believe that hardware support is getting much better. You can install an SSD without worrying about it. You can install generally a CPU without worrying about it. You can install a graphics card maybe a couple weeks after release without worrying about it. But peripherals are tricky. I know manufacturers that creating Linux-specific drivers, that's an engineering hurdle. Class-compliant devices are amazing in Linux. I have a Focusrite Scarlett sitting behind me, which is a pretty nice audio interface. It literally just works on Linux. You plug it in, it just works. You don't even need to install a driver. Works great in Ardour, works good in GuitarX. The Scarlett is a good example of a device that is class-compliant, and it's really helpful.
But wait, there's a solution. All I have to do is follow these simple instructions to download a random script off GitHub and
Okay, be a little careful about that.
run it, with no indication given whatsoever for how exactly to run a script.
Okay, I think the criticism that he just put forth of there's not a good indication on this particular README about how to do that. Unfortunately, I think that like most larger open source projects actually have like very well written documentation. There are some smaller projects and like pet projects that sometimes don't get this same attention. The fact is that a lot of developers that work on open source projects do moonlight. Like we work at corporations that have private repositories on GitHub. Some organizations are very good about teaching their developers, like, write good documentation. We need you to, because when someone comes in here after you, we need them to know what to do. Unfortunately, some companies don't do that, and I think sometimes that writing good documentation is not a priority. That comes down to the project maintainer, and I think it's important. If your software is very end user focused, you should assume that these are there's basically novice users. They might need you to walk you through like cloning a Git repository, making a .sh file executable, running that. I think Linus's criticism here is fairly reasonable.
Even the process of downloading it was unintuitive.
So what he just did there, he he right-clicked on a link here and tried to save target as. That is a Windows thing. I understand his. That's not really a Windows thing. This is something that you'll often do when you're downloading something off of the internet on Windows. GitHub doesn't work this way, so he's sort of running into a bit of a headache that I'll get into and explain in better detail here in just a second.
I know GitHub is for developers and not for end users, but it's really hard to hide behind that shield when it took me less than 2 days to run into a situation where I had
Who's hiding, bro?
to use it. I mean, at that point, if GitHub is only for developers, then desktop Linux is only for developers.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack with what he just said. He said, if GitHub is only for developers, then desktop Linux is only for developers. And it is true that a lot of developers use Linux and a lot of developers use GitHub. Those things, two things, those are completely different things that operate independently of each other. And the transparency and good documentation that you would expect, that is the responsibility of the project's maintainer to write that stuff out. That doesn't have anything to do with Linux. I don't feel like that is a fair statement, and I don't think it's really an accurate statement either. I think it's a little problematic.
You can't have it both ways, unlike on LTT Store, where you can find great merch at fair prices. Our mouse mats are rated 5 stars with literally thousands of reviews. Go see what all the fuss is about at the link below. Anyway, I found a guide on how to run a script. I'm grateful for that, but I'm frustrated by the condescending tone.
Sometimes, if you're like on Stack Overflow, like you'll find that sometimes with people being a little condescending. It's just because they're just used to thinking about things in a certain way, and often from like a thought experiment point of view, like the points that they're making are technically valid. Just bear in mind that as a community, sometimes people get kind of stuck about thinking and communicating in a certain way. Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
I mean, my assumption that a file with a .sh extension would behave as I would expect it to and launch in some kind of script running application doesn't seem that unreasonable.
So for most other file extensions like .docx or like .mp3 or .png or whatever, like that's a fairly reasonable expectation. But for .sh files, for script files, there's a very good reason why that doesn't happen in Linux, and I can get into that in a moment.
Newsflash, random contributor, you can also change a file extension in Windows, and it will attempt to launch in the default program for that file type. It actually serves exactly the same fundamental purpose, hinting at the contents of the file. The only difference is that these hints for the user are also used as hints for the operating system. It's actually a lot more convenient than digging into the properties of the file to find out what it does.
I'm not sure what he means by that. Like, it's true that Linux handles file extensions differently than Windows, but like we still have file extensions that sort of point you to like what program you should attempt to open the file with. However, like this isn't always the case for like coding specific script file extensions like JavaScript or like Ruby or Perl, and there's a good reason for that as well.
Anyway, pompous tone aside, that contributor did help me figure out my GitHub download. So it turns out that right-click Save Target As gets you an HTML
Yikes.
file
No.
in .sh clothing because
That's not exactly how that's meant to be used. I'll explain that.
I don't know, some borderline arbitrary reason probably.
It's actually it's not an arbitrary reason. There's a very good reason for it.
And in order to get it to be an actual .sh file, I had to copy it into a text editor,
Yeah, you don't need to do that.
Kate, and then save that as a script and execute it in the terminal. It spat out a bunch of errors, and as I expected, most of the buttons don't work, but all the inputs and outputs that I had already configured in Windows did show up. My faders work. I even have my...
Okay, so like that's cool. Like he was able to overcome his technical challenge, right? Let's get into GitHub for a minute. Like I wanna help people that are looking at this video for the first time who may be interested in Linux or may be interested in GitHub or maybe don't care at all. You know, I want to give you some perspective into like how this tool works to kind of demystify like what's happening here. Okay, so let me close this video out real quick and let's just go over to GitHub. Okay, what we've got here now, this is the public open source repository that's you know, open for the world to see. You can click through any of these files. You can read all the code yourself. You know, we've got a fairly technical README here. This would be useful if you were a developer trying to test something or trying to build something with this. You would need to know this information. This level of technical sophistication is going to be way above what most end users are going to be comfortable with. And other applications that are like more tailored to getting like weird things like RGB to work or like, you know, some controller to work or something like that, or you just want some random like calendar application, like the readmes for that should be more approachable. That is if they're writing good readmes. That's a responsibility of the project maintainers, like I said. Okay, so with what we got here, this is the web UI of GitHub, right? And so what Linus is doing is like, and I sort of understand why he's making this assumption. I think he's looking at this as, you know, as like links basically. Like this is fairly typical that you'll be on a web page while you're running Windows and find a link to like a .msi or .exe and you'll, you know, save target as and download that sucker. This is just not how GitHub works. And I can understand the confusion here if you're new to GitHub, if you're new to Linux. Let's take a second and look at a better way of doing what Linus just described. Okay, so when you're looking at GitHub, you need to be aware of this pretty green button here. This green button is your friend. I know it says code, which might be a little intimidating, but now you can download a .zip that is going to contain like all the files that you're going to need from this repository, or you can get a little bit more technical with it and grab this guy here, and I'll get into that in just a second. Now, good project maintainers will do a couple of different things. If the package is popular and is used, you know, by a lot of people on Linux, generally what they'll do is they'll package like an installer. These files will usually be notated with like .rpm or like .deb if you're on Debian or like Red Hat respectively. Those are basically like click installers, kind of like a .exe or like a .msi would be, you know, on Windows. So that's an option that is, you know, often available. Sometimes there'll be links to the software developer's public website where you can grab that stuff. Sometimes there'll be zip archives that are linked here, and sometimes there'll be, you know, relatively well thought out instructions that will tell you what to do. If there's not those things, and if you're kind of questioning how the heck do I get it? All right, remember you can download the zip, or you can kind of step into Git land here, right? Grab this URL from here. This is a public open repository. You can clone this down to your local machine without needing special permission. Now, what you cannot do is you cannot push code up to this project. That is reserved for contributors and people that have access to this repository. So let me show you how to grab this stuff. Go ahead, copy that, open up your terminal here if you want to go into terminal land. Let's do like a listing. Let's figure out where I am. Okay, so my home directory is kind of a mess because I have all these random OBS files in here. So I'm not going to subject you to that. Let's go ahead and CD into like documents just for giggles here. Let's take a listing. All right, it's empty right now. Now, if I want to clone this repository down, if I want to get a copy of all of this code, all I need to do, I need to enter in 2 words into this terminal. They're git clone, right? Pretty simple. Now, paste this URL right after that command, okay? Hit enter. It's cloning that, okay? You can hit ls again to see the contents of the documents folder. You can bring up Nautilus here, which is your default file explorer if you like to navigate that way, right? So that DXVK folder is there. Now, I can do it this way with the GUI, or I can CD into DXVK, which is the repository I just cloned. I can take a listing here and see all the contents of that project. Now, if I want to get really technical with it and see what's in exactly what this code is, I can open all of this up in a text editor. A lot of editors these days are using a lot of developers are using VS Code. This is a great product by Microsoft. You can open that up by just hitting code dot. What that dot is it's saying here. Open code here in this DXVK file. All right, it's gonna think about it for a second. This is a pretty big project, so it might take a quick second. I got a lot of RAM, so it happens pretty quick. It's gonna say, hey, you trust these people? Yeah, that's fine. I trust them. Now, this is where all this code is visible, right? So this is not something that you're gonna need to know as a non-developer. I just wanna show you like how to download this stuff, how to look at it. Okay, so let's just say, for instance, in Linus's case, let's say let's just CD out of this directory. Let me put up a scenario here. Okay, Linus said that he needed a shell file. If this actually contained a shell file here, what he would need to do in order to run that, it's a file that contains scripts that can execute, right? And so you do not want to kind of have a paradigm where you click on a shell file and it just does whatever is in that file. Like that is not a good idea, and there's a very, very, very good reason why Linux does not allow this. Okay, let's say I had a folder. Let's say I cloned down a folder from GitHub, and just say like whatever, folder. Let's CD into the folder I just made. Okay, if you want to create a file, like a shell file, like from scratch, you can actually, and I'm just going to do this for the purpose of demonstration, you can use a command called touch. Right? We're just going to put touch in, and then we're going to say, foo.sh. Okay? It's going to make that for me. If I hit this, you can see there's a file here, right? It's a shell file here. It's noted with that .sh. Okay? Now, what I can do, I could open this file up, whatever. I'm not going to actually put code in here because I just don't feel like getting into that right now. I don't think that that's pertinent. But what I could do if I wanted to just like copy something in here like quickly, I could do a couple of different things. I could type in nano foo.sh, okay? And it's actually going to open that like right up in the command line here. So that's kind of cool, right? Like you actually get a text editor that like just opens, and you could just put like some stuff, shell stuff. Cool. If you wanted to save that, you could just hit like Control S and then Control X to edit it. You can open this up as well in other text editors by using gedit. That's the basic text editor that ships with GNOME on Fedora. You can open that up here. Yeah, copy and paste whatever you need in. If you wanted to get real technical with it, you could type in code foo.sh. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. It's yelling at me. It's like, oh, wait. Okay. So that's how you create a file, right? I think that's useful to know. Like you could grab that raw content, file content, and then copy it in here, and then run your script. There's two commands that he's about to get into, and I'm going to show you what those are, and I'm going to explain why this is the way it is. Okay. The first command that you're going to need to run to make a shell script executable is going to be chmod plus x. Then I'm going to want to type in the name of my file, foo. I don't have to type out the whole command. I can hit tab, and it's gonna kind of guess and fill that out for me. This makes that gives this file like permission to run. It makes it runnable. If I hit ls here, you can actually see that like my white file label here is turned green. That means, hey, you're ready to go. You can run this. Now, to run this file, what I need to do is I need to type in, if I'm in the current directory that this file is in, which might be easier for you if you're sort of unfamiliar with how to lay out like paths in terminal here, you just cd into the directory that it's in. Now put foo.sh and run it. If this contained code, at this point this would run because I've given it permission to do so. So yeah, I hope that wasn't too like abstract or like technical or weird. I just kind of wanted to break it down and show you that it's actually not quite as intimidating as it might seem. Yeah. I wish that READMEs would sort of explain things like this. Unfortunately, a lot of them assume that you're going to know this kind of stuff, and a lot of people just don't. Now, what Linus is trying to do is he's trying to go in here, into one of these files here. Here's a good example: setup.dxvk.sh. So if I actually wanted to, I don't want to set up dxvk on my computer right now because I already have it. But if I wanted to do that, what I would do is I would just clone that whole repository down, cd into it, and then do exactly what I just did, and that would run that command. Okay, there's probably other steps involved here because this is complex. A lot of repositories aren't going to be like this, but it's a good example. So back to what I was saying. I'm sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. Linus is attempting to, click here and grab the target, and he's getting an HTML file. Okay, why is he getting an HTML file? Well, this has something to do with how GitHub is intended to be used. So what we have here is basically a listing of the current versions of all of these files in the branch in which they're stored, okay? And, like every branch might have slightly different versions of these files, right? You can actually see, this is kind of interesting, you can see when it was last edited, who did what, when they did it. For the most part, what's going to happen is like feature branches are going to be created. These are all these other branches up here. And eventually that code is going to get merged here into master, and that's going to get deployed, and it's going to be shipped. Okay. So the reason why this exists as it is here, the reason why this brings you to this page is because when you are working locally with code, like if I had my little, I think it probably will open to the last thing I had open. If I had my little, text editor open here, I'm doing things. As I'm doing this, if I'm working on a large project, there could be thousands of developers. Usually a couple hundred is fairly typical for larger organizations. Changes are going to be happening constantly on the branch that you're working on, and having this web UI here, like this is not the most surefire way of checking these things, but it is not uncommon at all for developers to kind of look up and look at these files, track these changes and say, hey, what the heck is different? Like, why is this here? Because as we work, things diverge and change. And having this web UI here is a very convenient way of tracking what's happening. It's probably not the best way of doing it, but it's an option available to you. This serves a purpose. This is not for downloading code. It just isn't. This is kind of extra, but like there's a little blame feature here. You can see exactly like what changes were made by who and when. So this gets fairly technical. I just wanted to clarify what this is used for, why Linus was getting what he was getting, and yeah, that's kind of GitHub in a nutshell. I hope that wasn't too much. Let's get back to the video and finish out here.
Button until my GoXLR loses power for any reason, at which point I will have to pass it through to Windows, reconfigure it in Windows, and then pass it back over to Linux without losing power. Compared to that, all the other stuff is minor.
Yikes.
I hope.
The most notable
He
issue
hopes.
I had was that my audio devices were just kind of screwy in OBS.
Okay, I actually, believe it or not, I had an experience sort of similar to this when I was just setting up OBS. I'm not sure exactly why. Let me just keep going
My
for a
voice
second.
came across very unnaturally deep, and it sounded like my mic input had been duplicated.
My voice just feels deep right now. I don't know if I've got something lodged or what.
And
Yeah.
Chat with
Okay, Darth Luke. There could be a configuration reason for that. Pulse Audio is the it's a component of the default audio stack that is shipped on a lot of major Linux distributions, and Pulse works fairly well, though sometimes it does have like these weird little playback glitches that will sort of manifest themselves in these pops and clicks and like delays and just sort of like fuzziness when playback is started. This is incredibly frustrating. I think there is I think there's a reason for this behind the scenes. I'm not sure if it has something to do with like how Pulse manages sample rates and like against how applications like manage like what sample rate is set. There might be something there. If you're running Pulse Audio and you're having this crackling kind of weirdness, it likely has something to do with that. Fedora is really, at this point, it's very, very, very current. And it has shipped with a new, like, revised audio stack. I think Pipewire is a component of it. And I will say that the audio quality that I'm experiencing on these last two releases is significantly improved over anything that Pulse was giving me for these little fine details that you hear. By and large, like, Pulse is serviceable, but yeah, it's frustrating. You can get it working well, but it takes some weirdness. I was actually having some weirdness with Pulse as I was like setting up OBS for this recording, and I actually had to switch my my audio capture device to ALSA, and I don't know why. That tended to work better. I don't know if that'll work better in all cases. I have a really old web camera. I'm not sure. It worked for me.
was pretty convinced that I had set something up incorrectly, and if I was a viewer of my stream, I probably would have said the same thing. But I've been using OBS for like 6 or 7 years now, so I had my doubts. I even streamed my OBS settings panel to prove it, but eventually, feeling out of options, I just restarted OBS, and yeah, that solved pretty much everything.
Yeah, it may be that sample rate. It could just be a weird Pulse thing. Sorry about that, man.
Which was kind of frustrating, because I've heard time and time again that you don't have to turn things off and on again to get them working in Linux, but hey.
Okay, so people say this, and I think I understand what they mean, but it gives the wrong impression. Now, it is very true that most updates like don't require a hard reboot of your operating system on Linux. Now, there are some kernel updates, and I think even some of the Nvidia proprietary driver updates actually do require a good reset in order for those things to kind of fall into place. But by and large, you actually can sort of update Linux and not restart it. That doesn't mean that you're not going to need to restart your computer occasionally to get things working right. I think where this comes from is sort of the server space, right? Like, it is not uncommon for Linux servers to run for years without being restarted. And there's a good reason why people like brag on this, and it's because like enterprise servers take a heck of a long time to start up. It is a completely different animal than your desktop computer or your laptop computer. I know we think as servers as super fast computers, but they're also incredibly complicated. So not having to restart your server is a good thing if you can help it. This isn't completely true in the desktop space. It's also not uncommon where, like, if you're changing configuration files or system related things, You may not have to cold restart the system in order for those changes to go into place. You may just have to restart a service. But, there's the rub. You're still technically restarting things, right? I don't know if that's pertinent to what Luke's experiencing, but there's some context on why people say that.
Maybe that's just because I'm not really great at Linux yet.
You're not bad at Linux.
Not sure. On the good side of things, though, my mixer has worked flawlessly from the start. Though it is pretty simple as far as mixers go. I didn't have to change any settings, I didn't have to install anything for it, I just set it as my default input device and was good to go.
Once I got PAMAC figured out, getting comms going was surprisingly simple. PAMAC is a program with a graphical user interface that functions similarly to the Pacman package manager that you operate in the terminal. At least it does once you find the hidden button in PAMAC to search Snap, Flatpak, and Arch user repository entries.
Cool.
It's basically like the pop shop from
So PAMAC seems cool. I can sort of empathize a little bit with him on his confusion regarding the UI in Linux. I really like the minimalist approach to it. I find that for me, I'm better able to make sense of it. Windows, while it does have some nice UI features, it can be fairly cluttered. And for some people, all that contextual details of familiar looking icons that they're used to seeing, that gives them information that allows them to navigate faster. For people like me, it really doesn't. And I can understand if you're looking at this UI for the first time, how you might feel that a settings wheel or a checkbox was hidden. It just takes some getting used to, man. You'll start to recognize patterns.
Pop OS, except it didn't try to brick my system the first time I used it.
Yeah, ouch, sorry about that.
The only really difficult thing was choosing the right package to install for Discord. There's regular Discord, and then there's Canary Discord.
So canaries, that's a development build. I think the expression comes from canary in a coal mine, right? It's meant to catch bad things. It's meant to catch bugs. If you don't feel like being a beta tester or being on the bleeding edge, just go with the stable. That's fine.
Whatever that is. I chose the most official looking package and I was up and running almost immediately once I found the super convenient per application volume mixer in the bottom right corner. The interface is kind of kludgy, scrolling with your mouse wheel scrolls through both the audio devices and the levels of the individual devices, which is...
Yeah, even some software like Discord, some of the UI in Linux is for some applications it's really good, and for others it's just not quite there yet.
It's not great. But other than that, it works really well, and my first voice call to Luke went completely without a hitch. Or it would have if I'd known that it was starting. Unfortunately, I actually still have not figured out how to get desktop notifications working. I found a guide, but instructions fell apart almost immediately.
Not sure on
when
that
my
one, I don't
Discord
know.
package didn't show up in the list where it's supposed to be for me to fix it.
So I like this here. Discord desktop notifications have magically fixed themselves. No idea how. I guess it could be a configuration thing, maybe, or just a Discord thing. But Gremlins, dude, it happens.
I think that's probably a project for another day.
Discord was an easy install for me. Again, it was just automatically available in Package Manager. That being said,
Nice.
There was certain missing features. Screen sharing across Slack, Teams, and Discord are kind of sketchy at best. They feel less stable, or they're even missing some features here and there. Outside of that, there's even really simple stuff missing every now and then.
This is all valid. There are some features in cross-platform applications that just aren't fully fleshed out in Linux yet. A lot of those applications work reasonably well. If I can just give some context there, we didn't have some of these things until recently, so keep that in mind. I didn't mean to stop your face there, Luke. Sorry, buddy.
If I download a file in Slack and then try to click the Open Containing Folder button, just nothing happens. And speaking of missing features, I used the phone app for the Elgato Control Center just like Linus did. I had found another solution through a script on GitHub, but I thought that way would potentially be problematic in the long term, so I just avoided it. Unfortunately for my camera, however, Canon EOS Utilities doesn't work on Linux. I'd been using that software on Windows for quite a while now to get a live feed from my Canon 70D over USB to my computer. It was flawless and didn't require a capture card. I do have an AVIO 4K capture card, which does work on Linux, but I don't have the micro HDMI cable that it would need to connect to my camera. I could pick one up, but just for this challenge, I decided to go with my old Logitech C920, which while it doesn't remotely look as good, it works just fine.
Have you
When
seen my
make
camera?
the window for it really small, no one can really tell.
So that's cool. Like his hardware like works with a little bit of a workaround. That's not uncommon to have to do something like that.
I think overall the easiest part for me was getting my Camlink 4K up and running. It was garbled when I selected one of the duplicate sources in OBS, but immediately after trying the second one, it cleared up and has been picture perfect ever
That
since.
looks really good.
So it works, but there's a much larger upfront investment in getting it working.
That's
The
fair.
question is just whether it feels worth it.
In the end, it worked. If you connected to the stream after we were done, about
They did a good job with this. This looks good.
15 minutes of troubleshooting while we were just in the thick of trying not to starve, I'm sure any random viewer wouldn't have been able to tell a difference between one of my old Windows streams and this one. Audio
I
was
can't.
good, capture was good. That's where the good ends, however. Literally everything I used past this point was a lesser experience compared to its Windows counterpart. Almost everything was missing
Sometimes.
at least one feature, and some, I'd say most notably OBS and Teams, were just buggy, requiring restarts for simple settings to actually apply, and had other various problems. It definitely wasn't impossible, and it was actually easier than I expected, but due to various bugs, missing features, and incompatible software, it wasn't as simple or clean as doing it on Windows, but I wouldn't say that was enough for it to be a deal breaker.
Luke is kind of feeling it a little bit. So I've heard tales of screen sharing on Teams, both good and bad. I might want to look into that to see what the current state of that is, because I use a lot of Teams at work.
For me, the bottom line is what you're looking to get out of it. If you're daily driving Linux for game
Yes.
streaming out of a genuine passion for learning more about it,
Yes.
then have at it. Have fun. But just
If you want to be a part of this community, stream Linux games. If that's something you're interested in, yeah, there's a lot of creators that do that.
know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
PC gaming already requires a certain amount of tinkering. I mean, there's a reason that more people game on consoles. You know, whether it's trying to track down save files in some Vista era folder or forcing an aspect ratio in an INI file. But a Linux gaming PC, it requires all of that crap and then another mountain of crap on top of it.
I don't know if I would call it crap, but like it's work, buddy.
Like when something doesn't work, you can tell yourself, well, I never wanted to use that functionality, or I never wanted to play that game anyway. But
I've found myself saying this, and the point he's about to make is accurate.
honestly, it just comes across as sour grapes. It is not that easy to use.
Sometimes it isn't.
The good news, though, is that a shocking number of experiences don't start and end with, sorry, you can't do this. So stay tuned for part 3, where Luke and I are going to be trying to get as many games up and running as possible, starting with Twitch's top 20 and then expanding into some of our personal favorites. It's going to be a really good one. Just like
sure.
this message from our sponsor.
All right, so let me just finish out there. I feel like I've talked a lot in this video. It's probably stretching on a little bit longer than I think most YouTubers would want to sit around. So yeah, hopefully this was entertaining to some of you. All right, like that last bit that Linus just said, I think is particularly like insightful, right? And when you are a new Linux gamer, like approaching this thing, like what you need to understand is like you need to sort of like curb your expectations a little bit and use the resources that are available to you, whether that's like Lutris forums or Reddit or even Stack Overflow. There's actually gaming content on there. It's kind of funny. Or ProtonDB or like whatever. Use that information that's out there to look at your library in a very specific way and say to yourself, what titles do I really care about that I feel that with the information I have, I can feasibly get up and running with maybe a little bit of effort and still have like a really good gameplay experience. And if you go from that perspective, like it actually isn't that bad. So like there are certain things about gaming on Linux, it's not ideal, but like I wouldn't say that gaming on Linux is a bad experience either. Just like for reference, like things are happening pretty quickly. For instance, like Age of Empires 4 released like 4 or 5 weeks ago, I don't know, And when that game launched, it was borked on ProtonDB. It did not work. And there are reports coming in of people like actually being able to run the game with a few like caveats. You know, they're running into some issues, but there are also reports of people reporting that they're able to play online with like no issue at all, and the game runs great. There are plans, I believe, in the next release candidate of Proton to add some fixes that should make Age of Empires 4, more playable. And like that's actually a pretty good timeline in terms of like Linux games. Or Windows games that you can run in Linux. Horizon Zero Dawn, like that's another, it's a graphically intense title that like I was really interested in playing, and for a long time it was borked on Linux. It did not work, and it took 6 months or so. Like I think about 6 months ago, it kind of started getting to a point where it was playable. And now people are reporting that they're actually having like a really good experience on Horizon Zero Dawn, that it's running, just as well as it does on Windows. Death Stranding, that was another, title that for a long time didn't run on Linux very well at all. Now you can play it. It just sort of like depends on how you approach the problem, right? Like if I was sitting on Mac OS, would I expect to be able to run like native Windows exclusive Windows titles? No, I wouldn't expect that. If I was sitting on Xbox, would I expect to be able to run native exclusive Nintendo games or exclusive PlayStation games? I wouldn't expect that. The reality is that like you can run these titles on Linux, many of them at least. It just comes down to a matter of like whether or not you should, right? Like Windows is a great operating system. I do 95% of my computing and gaming in Linux, but I'm not too bullheaded to refuse to switch over and use the tools available to me there if that's the best thing for the job. I will say this, like if this is something that interests you, if you want to do your homework and work on getting these titles running in Linux, like it can provide a very good experience where like you actually have an opportunity to like peel like behind some of the like obscurity that like Windows will put up in front of you and kind of see like how these things are actually working. And this can be like a really educational process that I think for a lot of people is rewarding. If you're the type of gamer that you want to have the newest, most graphically demanding titles running immediately on launch at the highest settings with the highest FPS, like you're probably not going to have a great time if you come at it with that. It really all depends on like your perspective. That being said, things are constantly getting better. There are titles that are launching now that work first day or maybe a week or so after launch that run great on Linux. There are a lot of titles that I really enjoy that honestly, when I'm running them in Linux versus on Proton versus Windows, like there is a performance difference. But in many cases, it's not that significant. In some cases, it is. Like you just have to do your homework and decide like what you're willing to work with, and if it's something that interests you enough that you're able to sort of take that perspective and attack it. So yeah, I congratulate LTT for like taking this effort and poking our community a little bit, and they've produced actually quite a lot of Linux content in the last few years. So just happy that we have this dialogue going, and yeah, I look forward to the next video. I know this went a little bit long, guys. I hope this was helpful. Yeah, check you later. Have a good one. Bye.